The news reached them in the strangest of places. Not on a battlefield, not in the ruins of Berlin, but in a quiet country estate hidden in the English countryside. It was August 6, 1945, when the men who once powered Hitler's most secret scientific dreams learned what had just happened in Japan. Inside Farm Hall, a manor disguised as a prison, 10 of Germany's leading nuclear experts sat under lock and key, unaware that British intelligence had wired every wall with hidden microphones. Every word, every sigh, every whisper over breakfast tea was being recorded. That afternoon, a British officer entered their dining room and announced that an American bomb had wiped out an entire city. At first, they laughed. Then the officer told them the name, Hiroshima, and the laughter stopped. Farm Hall wasn't really a prison, at least not one that looked like one. From the outside, it appeared peaceful. Ivy-covered walls, gardens stretching into the horizon, a place that could have belonged to a retired aristocrat. Inside, though, were the brightest minds of the German Reich. Werner Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, Kurt Diebner, and others who had once worked on the Nazi nuclear program. They believed they were merely being held for questioning until the political dust settled. But the British had a far more cunning plan. They wanted to know how far Hitler's scientists had come, and how much they truly understood about the atom. So they bugged everything. That evening, the prisoners gathered for supper when the guard walked in with the day's news. His tone was casual, almost indifferent, as he told them that the United States had dropped a single bomb on Japan, and the city it hit had vanished in seconds. At first, disbelief filled the room. Some muttered that it was Allied propaganda, another psychological trick meant to humiliate them. Others laughed it off entirely, certain it was scientifically impossible. But the guard continued, detailing the explosion's intensity, the shockwave radius, the blinding light that had leveled an entire metropolis. One by one, the smiles faded. The men looked at each other, uncertain, their confidence unraveling with every sentence. Werner Heisenberg, the physicist once trusted by Hitler to deliver Germany's atomic weapon, sat perfectly still, his brow furrowed as the implications sank in. If the details were accurate, then the Americans had achieved something he had deemed unreachable. He reached for a pencil and began writing on a sheet of paper, muttering calculations under his breath. The other scientists fell silent, watching him as the numbers filled the page. Minutes passed. Finally, Heisenberg stopped, stared at his notes, and whispered a sentence that changed everything. "It's real. They've done it." The room went dead quiet, then erupted in overlapping voices. Disbelief, denial, anger, and awe, all colliding at once. The recordings later revealed that moment in haunting clarity. Chairs scraped, voices rose, and the tension built as brilliant men realized the war's true end had not come with Hitler's death, but with a bomb they could have built, yet never did. Some swore it was impossible. Others demanded proof. But deep down, they all sensed the truth. The Americans had surpassed them in both science and scale. The microphones hidden in the walls captured the sound of Europe's finest scientists, arguing over who was to blame for Germany's greatest scientific failure. Otto Hahn, the chemist who had first discovered nuclear fission in 1938, sat apart from the chaos. His face had gone pale. "My discovery," he said quietly, "has killed 100,000 people." Overcome with guilt, he stood and left the room. The others didn't follow. They were too busy turning on one another. Von Weizsäcker blamed the Nazi regime, claiming their obsession with immediate victories had starved the research program of funds. Diebner shot back that the problem wasn't money, but arrogance. Too many competing egos, too little focus. The microphones caught every accusation, every bitter word from men whose dreams had just been obliterated by an American invention. Heisenberg defended himself with the calm tone of a man trying to salvage his legacy. He explained that their efforts had centered on building reactors, not weapons. The goal, he claimed, had been to harness energy, not to construct bombs. Some of the others nodded reluctantly, but a few refused to let him off so easily. "We could have done it," one voice muttered. "We just didn't try hard enough." The air grew heavy with silence. Then, in a moment of blunt honesty, Paul Hartek said what none of them wanted to admit. "We were simply behind. The Americans were better." It was the first time that anyone in the room spoke without pride. That admission changed the atmosphere entirely. The anger turned inward. As the night deepened, Heisenberg refused to rest. He sat at his desk long after the others had gone to bed, surrounded by crumpled papers and half-finished equations. He couldn't stop thinking about how they'd done it, how the Americans had managed to achieve the impossible. By dawn, the truth began to form in his mind. The secret, he realized, wasn't just scientific. It was industrial. The Americans had resources on a scale Germany could never dream of matching. Heisenberg gathered the group again the next morning to explain what he had discovered. He walked them through the principles of bomb design. 2 possible paths, uranium or plutonium. Both would work, but each required unimaginable quantities of refined material. That refinement process demanded enormous facilities and thousands of workers. The Americans, Heisenberg said, must have used something called gaseous diffusion, a method so vast and complex it required entire cities of machines running nonstop. We never had anything close to that, he admitted. Our methods were too slow, too small. One scientist muttered bitterly, "We worked in basements. They worked in factories the size of towns." Nobody disagreed. The realization was devastating. It wasn't genius that had won the war, it was infrastructure. America had not only the scientific minds, but also the factories, labor, and money to turn theory into weaponry. Germany, crushed by war on all sides, had nothing left but brilliant ideas and broken laboratories. Heisenberg's calculations confirmed it. Even if Germany had known exactly how to build the bomb, they never could have produced it. "This isn't physics anymore," he murmured. "It's power. Industrial power." For the first time, the men who had once served the Führer understood the real meaning of defeat. But the greatest shock came not from the scientists, but from the soldiers who had been listening quietly at the table's edge. Among the prisoners at Farm Hall were 3 German generals, men who had commanded divisions, fought campaigns, and watched their empire collapse. They had listened to the scientific debate in silence until one of them, General Erich von Stein, finally spoke. His voice was low and measured. "Gentlemen," he said, "you're missing the point." The scientists turned toward him, puzzled. Von Stein looked up from his tea. "This bomb doesn't just end a war. It ends the idea of war itself." At first, they didn't understand. The physicists were still thinking in terms of kilotons and blast yields. But von Stein was thinking in centuries. He explained that whoever possessed such a weapon no longer needed armies or trenches. They would rule not through conquest, but through fear. "This," he said, "is the end of military history. America now holds more power than every empire before it combined." The room fell silent again. Every man there, scientist and soldier alike, felt the weight of his words. They weren't witnessing a new weapon. They were witnessing the birth of a new world order. Von Stein leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Even if we had built the bomb first," he said, "we still would have lost." The statement stunned them. How could victory still have been impossible? But the general explained patiently. America was vast, protected by oceans, rich in materials, and united by will. Germany was small, surrounded, and broken by ideology. "You cannot win against a nation that can build this," he said. "You can only fall behind it." The scientists listened, realizing that their equations had never stood a chance against geography, politics, and industrial might. The scale of America's achievement now seemed incomprehensible. Germany's nuclear program had perhaps 100 scientists, scraping together resources in war-torn cities. The Manhattan Project had over 130,000 workers spread across entire secret towns. The Americans had spent $2 billion, 40 times what Germany ever invested. One of the Germans whispered, "We never stood a chance." Von Stein nodded slowly. "The war," he said, "was lost before it even began. It wasn't a defeat of science, but of civilization. One system collapsing under its own arrogance while another, across the ocean, reached for the stars." Then the conversation turned to Hitler himself, the man whose decisions had shaped everything. Heisenberg revealed that he had once tried to explain nuclear theory to the Führer. It was 1942, in the midst of Germany's apparent dominance. Hitler had listened briefly, then interrupted. "How long will it take?" he demanded. "At least 3 years," Heisenberg replied. Hitler waved his hand dismissively. "Too long. I need weapons now." The scientists exchanged glances. That was the moment it ended, Heisenberg said. The moment Germany abandoned the future for the illusion of quick victories. Hitler had wanted rockets, tanks, and jets, toys he could parade, not theories he couldn't understand. To make matters worse, the dictator's prejudice had poisoned his own chances. Hitler had called nuclear research Jewish science and forced out the very minds who could have made it possible. Einstein, Born, Bethe, and others, all exiled, all hunted, all gone. "We drove away our victory," one scientist said bitterly, and America welcomed it. The irony was suffocating. The men who had once been dismissed, persecuted, or feared in Germany were now building the future for their enemies. "Our greatest weapon," Heisenberg murmured, "was never the atom. It was our arrogance." And that arrogance, the recordings captured, had destroyed them long before Hiroshima ever did. The conversation at Farm Hall shifted from shock to introspection. The scientists, who once debated atomic masses and reaction rates, now found themselves dissecting the man who had ruled them. The microphones caught the tension. Not anger this time, but quiet resignation. Hitler, they realized, had doomed them long before the first bomb fell. His impatience, his obsession with spectacle, and his contempt for intellect had turned Germany's brightest potential into a dead end. "He wanted miracles, not science," one of them said softly. "He couldn't understand what he couldn't see." And so, the bomb that could have been built in Germany was instead unleashed by their enemies. Heisenberg's voice grew heavy as he recalled his 1942 meeting with the Führer. He described how he had tried to explain the theoretical power locked within the atom, how he had spoken of chain reactions and critical mass. But Hitler had grown bored. "How long will it take?" he'd asked again. "At least 3 years," Heisenberg replied. That was all it took for Hitler to lose interest. "Then it is useless," he said. He wanted instant victories, weapons that could be built and paraded within months. He saw nuclear research as abstract nonsense, a waste of time during a war that he thought would be over in a year. The irony was unbearable. As the scientists at Farm Hall pieced together the timeline, they realized that Germany had possessed all the theoretical building blocks for the atomic bomb as early as 1939. They had the knowledge, the equations, and the minds. But the regime had neither the patience nor the foresight. Instead, they poured their resources into rockets, jet fighters, and supertanks, symbols of power rather than instruments of it. "He cared more about propaganda than progress," one of the generals muttered. The others nodded. They all knew it was true. Germany's defeat had been written in the arrogance of its leadership. What struck the British listeners most, however, wasn't the scientific regret. It was the moral one. The recordings captured moments of silence that stretched for minutes, broken only by the sound of footsteps or a chair creaking. Otto Hahn, still haunted by what his discovery had unleashed, confessed that he could not sleep. "I feel as though I share in the guilt," he whispered. Others disagreed. "We only opened the door," another replied. They chose to walk through it. Yet beneath the surface, every man in that house understood that history would not remember them as victims of circumstance. They were the men who failed to stop catastrophe. The discussion drifted again to the Americans, how they had managed to succeed on a scale so unimaginable. Heisenberg listed the numbers like a grim litany. Over 130,000 people working on the Manhattan Project, entire secret cities built for a single goal, and a budget 40 times larger than Germany's. The sheer logistics were staggering. "This is what happens when a nation is united in purpose," one general said. "We were divided by politics, suspicion, and fear." The realization was painful. Even if Germany had built the bomb first, it could never have matched America's stability or resources. "We were fighting the world," Heisenberg murmured. They were fighting physics. The more they spoke, the clearer the truth became. The war had never truly been a contest of intelligence. It was a contest of systems, of freedom versus tyranny, of collaboration versus coercion. America's democracy had allowed scientists to share ideas freely, while Germany's dictatorship had driven its best minds away. Hitler's hatred had scattered the very people who could have secured his victory. Einstein, Szilard, Teller, and Fermi, all refugees from the Reich, had built the bomb for his enemies. "We gave them our greatest weapon," one voice said bitterly. "Our own scientists." There was no rebuttal, only silence and the soft crackle of the hidden microphones. As dawn approached, the tone of the conversation changed again. The generals began to discuss what the new weapon meant for the world. Von Stein's earlier words lingered in the air. This bomb ends the idea of war. It was not a boast, but a prophecy. He explained that humanity had crossed an invisible threshold, one where destruction had outpaced reason. From now on, wars would be fought in laboratories, not trenches. There will be no more Stalingrads, he said quietly. Only threats. Only fear. The scientists listened without arguing. None of them had the heart to deny it. They knew he was right. Heisenberg sat with his head in his hands. "It is strange," he said, almost to himself. "We wanted to harness the atom for energy, to illuminate cities. Instead, it has burned one to ashes." His words carried no self-defense, only fatigue. For years, he had been branded the architect of a weapon he never built, the man who could have changed the war, but didn't. Now he realized that perhaps failure had spared them something worse. Some of the men even seemed grateful, relieved that they hadn't succeeded in time. One of them said softly, "Perhaps it's a mercy that it wasn't us." By mid-morning, the house had fallen into uneasy quiet. The men who once commanded the Third Reich's scientific future now sat as captives of a world remade. British intelligence officers later reviewed the recordings, astonished not only by the information revealed, but by the emotion behind it. The microphones had captured something no interrogation ever could: the sound of realization, of brilliant men finally understanding the scale of their defeat. For the Allies, it was a priceless revelation. For the prisoners, it was the beginning of a long reckoning. In one of the final recorded exchanges, a scientist asked quietly, "What happens now?" It was a question meant for no one in particular, but von Stein answered anyway. "Now," he said, "we live in America's world, and we pray they use this power wisely." The line was simple, but chilling. It marked the moment when Germany's dream of supremacy dissolved completely. They were no longer the makers of destiny, but witnesses to it. The microphones clicked faintly in the background, capturing every last syllable before the conversation faded into silence. British intelligence analysts later compiled the transcripts, astonished at what they contained. The recordings weren't just a technical report, they were a confession. They revealed not only how close Germany had come to the bomb, but why it had failed. The scientists had exposed the fatal flaw at the heart of Hitler's empire. It could conquer territory, but not ideas. It could silence dissent, but not replace genius. The Nazi state had been built to destroy, not to innovate, and in that destruction, it had sealed its own fate. In the weeks that followed, as the world grappled with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the farm hall transcripts were quietly archived. Few outside the highest levels of Allied command ever read them in full. Yet their message was unmistakable. The most dangerous weapon of the war had not been dropped from a plane. It had been hidden in a mansion, recorded in whispers and calculations. It was the sound of Germany realizing it had never stood a chance. Hitler never lived to hear about Hiroshima. By the time the bomb fell, he had been dead for months, entombed in the ruins of his own empire. But his absence echoed through every word his generals and scientists spoke. They all knew that if he had survived to see what America had done, he would never have understood it. The man who mocked Jewish physics could not have comprehended a world remade by it. In the end, the atomic bomb was more than a weapon. It was the final judgment on everything Hitler had built. The farm hall recordings stand today as one of the most extraordinary intelligence operations of the war, a window into the minds of men who witnessed their own failure unfold in real time. They revealed that Germany's defeat wasn't merely military or technological, but moral and ideological. The scientists who once believed they served the future discovered they'd been trapped in the past. And when they finally faced the truth, they did so not with rage, but with silence. The war had ended, but for those in Farm Hall, the reckoning had just begun. They were the last remnants of a vision that had consumed a continent, men who had touched the edge of godlike power and recoiled from it. Their story ended not with a weapon fired, but with a whisper recorded in the dark. "Now we live in America's world," von Stein had said, and history proved him right. For decades to come, the shadow of Hiroshima would stretch across the earth, the echo of that single moment when science, ambition, and humanity collided forever.